Tail family. When JFK at last ran for president, it was his well organized campaign that pushed him over the finishing line to one of the closest victories in history. A big factor in the victory was also his running mate, Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ had something JFK lacked, the ability to deal with Congress, and that would come in handy later. And so the prophecy had been fulfilled. John F. Kennedy was president. At 43, he's the youngest one ever elected. His charismatic young family is a breath of fresh air after the traditional old Eisenhowers. True to his old campaign slogan, the leadership had passed to a new generation, and a new era had begun. JFK's 1,036 days in office were full of political crisis and events. Soviet missiles in Cuba, and racial tensions in the South, the first American in space and the March on Washington. JFK had his triumphs and his failures. A lot of ambitious ideas died in Congress, yet his approval rating stayed high. Popular with the media and with the people, Jack and Jackie Kennedy were the king and queen of America. Jackie redecorated the White House and threw lavish parties with artists, poets, and musicians. Jack held his famous speeches. He spoke optimistically of a better world where peace and freedom is a possibility for all. Most people didn't know about Jack's failing health or his affairs with Marilyn Monroe, and the few who did, didn't care. The Kennedys were a source of optimism and comfort in the midst of a dangerous time. The fairy tale came to a sudden and brutal end when Jack was shot in the head. The image of the smiling and waving couple in the limousine, of Jackie's bloodstained pink Chanel suit, of Little John Jr. saluting his father's coffin at the funeral, is burned into everyone's mind forever. LBJ takes over. He has none of Jack's magical charisma, but so much more executive skill. He invokes the dead president's memory when he passes almost all of JFK's proposed legislation. He then gets America twisted up in Vietnam, and suddenly nobody wants to give him credit for anything. All his achievements are deposited on Jack's grave. A week after the assassination, Jackie gave the Kennedy presidency a posthumous name when she, in an interview, told the story about how Jack would listen to the soundtrack from the Broadway show Camelot. "Don't let it be forgot," she said, quoting a verse from the musical. "There once was a spot, for one brief shining moment, that was known as Camelot. There will be great presidents again," she added, "but there will never be another Camelot." John F. Kennedy's untimely death left his life and presidency an unfinished chapter. People didn't get to see what Camelot had in store for his second term, but at the same time, people didn't get to see John F. Kennedy grow old, his health fail, his love affairs exposed. The shots fired that day in Dallas put a tragic end to a romantic story and preserved the idealized memory of John F. Kennedy and his youth, vigor, and leadership for a long time. It's a story that is just way too good not to believe in.
He was a young, charismatic leader elected to office during one of the most turbulent times in American history. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today counting down our picks for the top 5 defining moments of John F. Kennedy's presidency. Before we begin, we publish new videos every day, so be sure to subscribe for more great content. For this list, we're focusing on the most memorable and significant moments from JFK's time in the Oval Office. These moments are not in chronological order, as we're ranking them based on their lasting impact. Number
He should simply be remembered as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, who saw suffering and tried to heal it, who saw war and tried to stop it. It was precisely what Bobby Kennedy sought to achieve in his life that made his death so tragic to Americans across the country. A politician who was converted to the fight for civil rights late in his career, Kennedy spent his time as New York Senator touring the country to bring awareness to poverty and inequality, particularly in communities of color. "My grandmother has a picture of the Kennedy brothers on her wall," said filmmaker Dawn Porter, director of the Netflix documentary series Bobby Kennedy for President. "I always grew up understanding that the Kennedys were very, very important to black people." In New York, Kennedy brought his fight for racial and economic equality to Brooklyn, where he picked Franklin A. Thomas to run the Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. "In my dealings with him, he was straight up, straight at you and clear," Thomas said in the documentary. "He was tough as nails. pushed by progressives to run for president against incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's campaign, was picking up speed when he won the Democratic primary in California. Hours after the victory, the 42-year-old was shot and wounded in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the next day, on June 6, 1968. He should simply be remembered as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, who saw suffering and tried to heal it, who saw war and tried to stop it. Just 5 years after the assassination of his brother, President John F. Kennedy, Bobby's death shook the nation. Kennedy's casket traveled across the country by train, bringing scores of Americans to the railroad tracks to pay their respects as the deceased senator passed. During the public viewing at St. Patrick's Cathedral, the New York Times described the collective grief as deep and often overwhelming. The viewers' faces were drawn, their eyes were wet, and the sobbing was often uncontrollable. Though his influence as a crusader for peace and equality reached across the country and around the world, RFK left a unique legacy in New York. We typically think of the Kennedys as a Massachusetts family, but Kennedy was the senator from New York and he never forgot that, said Porter. June 3rd, courting fame and vulnerability, the shooting of Andy Warhol. America's pop-art painter and filmmaker Andy Warhol stands in front of his double portrait of the late Hollywood film star Marilyn Monroe at the Tate Gallery in London, February 15, 1971. Our images. Widely considered the leader of the pop art movement throughout the 1960s, Andy Warhol was an artist who constantly sought the spotlight. He made eye-catching art out of everyday objects like soup cans and portraits of stars like Marilyn Monroe. When he was not making art, he was intentionally cultivating his social network. He collapsed the boundary between high art and popular culture, and he also returned realism to art after the reign of abstract expressionism and abstract painting, said WNYC's art critic Deborah Solomon. Warhol, born in Pittsburgh in 1928, worked in his Manhattan studio known as The Factory, where the cutting-edge artists of the day flocked. He gravitated toward fame and association with glamorous celebrities throughout his career, all the while maintaining his shy and soft-spoken persona. His job was to be Andy Warhol, said WNYC's Sarah Fishko, who has previously reported on Warhol. He put on whatever he put on, his outfit and makeup, or wig, glasses, and went through his day as that person. But Warhol's lifestyle and the free-spirited tenor of The Factory also made him exposed and vulnerable in a tumultuous era. On June 3, 1968, Warhol was shot in his studio by 30-year-old actor Valerie Solanas, who had had one of her scripts reportedly rejected by Warhol. In her bitterness and rage, Solanas attempted to kill him. In some way, he had let Valerie into his life, and by being Andy Warhol, he'd created a disappointment she could not live with, said author Stephen Cox said in Andy Warhol, a documentary film. Solanas pleaded guilty to assault and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. Warhol survived the shooting after extensive surgery, but carried the scars on his torso with him for the rest of his life. He died after complications from a gallbladder infection in 1987, in part because he had refused to return to the hospital for treatment in the preceding months. To some, it was miraculous that Warhol insisted on leading such an accessible life, despite his widespread fame, especially in the late 1960s, at a time of escalating civil unrest and assassinations of famous figures. I can't think of too many in that category who were so present in the minds and views of people on the streets of New York and who believed that nothing would happen to them, said Fishko. Everything changed. I think this was a period of tremendous change for art, for the city, for the culture, for politics. For everything. April 27th, Coretta Scott King speaks. Just 3 weeks after the assassination of the Rev. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Coretta Scott King traveled to New York City to deliver an anti-war speech to thousands of people gathered in Central Park. She stood on the stage where her husband had been scheduled to stand, giving a speech based on notes found in his jacket pocket after he died. I simply read them to you as he recorded them, Scott King solemnly told the crowd. And I quote, 10 Commandments on Vietnam. King's commandments condemn the U.S. government's narrative and framing of the war, rejecting the notion of America as a liberating force for the Vietnamese people. Later in the speech, Scott King, who had long opposed the Vietnam War and convinced her husband to come out publicly against it, went on to expand on his 10 Commandments. A passionate advocate for the poor, Scott King explained how America's investment in the war and its disregard for poor people were intimately intertwined. There is a kind of seamlessness with which she's moving back and forth between what is wrong with what the United States is doing in Vietnam with what is wrong with how the United States treats its citizens at home, said Jean Pioaris, political science professor at Brooklyn College who has written extensively about Scott King's influence on the civil rights movement. She gave me her address. I wrote her a thank you note, a handwritten one. She wrote me back personally. Pioaris says history misremembers Coretta Scott King as a bystander to the tumultuous era of the 1950s and 1960s. To truly understand the political evolution of Dr. King and how the civil rights movement progressed after his death, Pioaris suggests taking a closer look at Coretta Scott King. I think sometimes the way we mark the assassination of Dr. King is this long ago horrible tragedy that kind of ends the movement. And I think when we center Coretta Scott King, we see that the movement continues, said Pioaris. We see that the ideas that animated thrive. King's life carry on in people like Coretta Scott King and get expanded with the work that she does for the next 40 years. Those who knew Scott King personally remember her as a warm and gracious woman. Susan Johnson Cook, a reverend and former ambassador at large for religious freedom under President Barack Obama, first met Scott King at an event in New York City when Johnson Cook was a young girl. She gave me her address. I wrote her a thank you note, a handwritten one. She wrote me back personally, and that was the beginning of our relationship, Johnson Cook said. For a 10-year-old girl to receive a note from Mrs. Coretta Scott King in those days was such a marvelous move. Given Scott King's devotion to civil rights, Johnson Cook said her legacy as a leader of the movement should be widely recognized. I knew her when she was great and alive, but I'm glad the rest of the world is coming to know who Coretta Scott King was, said Johnson Cook. Not just meek and by the side, but in the front. April 23rd, the Columbia sit-in. Civil rights leader age. Rap Brown converted with the crowd outside the student-occupied Hamilton Hall on the campus of Columbia University on April 26, 1968. Ab photo. In late April 1968, student protesters threw Columbia University into turmoil. Hundreds of students took over several campus buildings in protest of the university's proposed construction of a gymnasium in a public park and its links to the Vietnam War. The students refused to leave until the university agreed to their demands. By the time the protests came to a close, more than 700 students had been arrested. We were a generation of people who watched on TV the napalming, the aerial chemical bombardment of civilians, said Nancy Biberman, who took part in the protest as a member of Students for a Democratic Society. It was grotesque, it was outrageous, and it enraged young idealistic students who thought that our government shouldn't be behaving in this way. We're contemplating possibilities now that we wouldn't have thought about generations ago. On the other hand, the struggles continue. The protests were organized by the SDS and the Students Afro-American Society, which was strongly opposed to the proposed gymnasium in Morningside Park in Harlem. Black students were occupying Hamilton Hall, adjacent to Harlem, which had just exploded in response a few weeks earlier to Dr. King's slaying, said Raymond Brown, a prominent student organizer with the SAS at Columbia University. Because of the proximity to Dr. Martin Luther King's death, Brown said, city and university officials were cautious about how to deal with the protesters. So it lasted longer than most comparable demonstrations, Brown told WNYC's Jamie Floyd. Despite their unifying passions, Brown said there were large rifts between African American students and white students when it came to their demonstration strategy. According to Biberman, women were also sidelined in the decision-making process and excluded from leadership positions among the organizers. Half a century later, Brown said he sees their action as one chapter in an ongoing lineage of political resistance. We're contemplating possibilities now that we wouldn't have thought about generations ago, Brown said. On the other hand, the struggles continue. The accounts of Brown, Biberman, and other students can be found in the book A Time to Stir, Columbia, 68. April 11th, the struggle for equal housing. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs into law the Civil Rights Open Housing Bill during a ceremony in the East Room of the White House on April 11, 1968. Ab photo. On April 11, 1968, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. Passed in the same month, King was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. The bill was a groundbreaking moment for the civil rights movement, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. But half a decade later, housing discrimination remains a pervasive issue, said Fred Freiberg, the executive director of the Fair Housing Justice Center. When we talk about all of the modern-day inequalities that exist in our society, you really can point to housing and where you live as being fundamental in that cycle, Freiberg told WNYC's Jamie Floyd. The organization takes an aggressive approach to investigating and rooting out housing discrimination in the New York City region. Among other tactics, such as filing lawsuits on behalf of claimants, the Housing Center hires actors to meet with landlords and collect information to see whether or not they are being illegally discriminated against. Some of the actors, known as testers, who have faced discrimination say the experience is deeply upsetting. What I take away from it is how devastating it is when you find out that you've been discriminated against, said Justin, who declined to use his last name. Even though I'm an actor, even though I'm portraying a role. The impact that it has on you emotionally, it just cannot be overstated. It's just a really sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, he said. According to Freiberg, housing discrimination is one of the building blocks of maintaining segregated neighborhoods. A recent report authored by New York City Council member Brad Langer found that New York City remains more segregated between black and white residents compared to other cities. More than 80% of New Yorkers who are white or black, according to the report, would have to move to a different neighborhood for black and white residents to be equally represented across the 5 boroughs. April 4th, when King was killed. Mourners, some carrying flags, parade down 7th Avenue in Harlem on the way to attend memorial service for the Red. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On April 7, 1968. Ab photo. As news spread of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the country in grief and anger. Newark, Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. saw full-blown riots that were met with a heavy police and military presence and resulted in more than 40 deaths. Although there were reports in New York City of fires and property damage, the nation's largest metropolis remained relatively calm on the evening of April 4th, and again the following day. Mayor John Lindsay himself walked through Harlem soon after he heard the news, and his presence and demeanor are often credited for the absence of violence and chaos. It became clear that there were people out in the streets in Harlem that night, and that's where he needed to be, said Clay Risen, author of A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination. The following day, Lindsay spoke about what he had witnessed in the streets of Harlem. I most certainly found the mood in New York City during my tours last night to be one of great grief, emotion, very deep emotion, with people weeping and frustrated and lonely, he said. and terribly lost and let down. I most certainly found the moods in New York City during my tours last night to be one of great grief, emotion, very deep emotion, with people weeping, and frustrated and lonely. And terribly lost and let down. Lindsay was a progressive Republican in an era fraught with racial tension and class division. Long before the moment he stepped out into Harlem that night, he had shown himself to be an advocate for civil rights, according to Errol Louis, a NY1 news anchor and former director of urban reporting at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. Footage courtesy of the NYC Municipal Archive with assistance from the Museum of the City of New York. All of his career leading up to that, he was taking some very unpopular political stands that would be unthinkable for a Republican in the current generation, Louis told WNYC's Janie Floyd. In other words, it wasn't just the mayor's actions on that night that could explain the lack of an uprising in New York City. 50 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Louis said New York City could use more political leaders who insist on solving the issues the civil rights leader passionately pursued. "1968 for 50 Years Later" is written by Janie Floyd, with production help from Mara Silvers. Matthew Schumann is the editor. Special thanks to WNYC archivist Andy Lancet and the NYC Munich Pell Archive for permission to use archival audio throughout this series.